we welcome Jane Connors to talk about something else.
Yeah. Do you want me to stand here?
No, do you want to sit down? Or do you
okay, cool. These are people who are affected.
Yeah. All right, good afternoon. As I mentioned, Jane Connors is here to talk about the Secretary General's latest report on special measures for protection from sexual exploitation and abuse. As you know, the annual report, looking back at 2019, focuses on our efforts to prevent and respond to sexual exploitation and abuse in line with the Secretary General's strategy. Just to give you a quick update on progress made, in 2019, we shifted data reporting process from a quarterly to a real-time approach to allow for better tracking status on allegations as reported as part of our efforts to increase transparency. We also introduced an internal tool called the iReport SCA Tracker that was done in May to facilitate the alignment of data and tracking of investigations relating to UN entities other than peacekeeping or special political missions. In addition, the Interagency Standing Committee established a $1 million fund managed by OCHA to scale up investigations through provisions of rapid grant to the entities of the committee. Last year, we also made training on SCA, sexual exploitation and abuse prevention, mandatory for all Secretariat personnel and personnel of 18 agencies, funds, and programs. That's just a few examples of the long-term effort, which, as you know, we continue to work to fight on the scourge of sexual exploitation and abuse. We asked Jane to come because the Secretary General's focus, as you will see in the report, is very much victim-centered approach. And I don't think Jane hasn't been here in a while, and we just wanted her to kind of expand on the victims approach. The numbers, I think, are in the report. I can answer a bit on the numbers, but we really want to focus on the victims. Jane, it's on.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great that it's on. I'm very happy to be here. I was last here at the end of 2017 when I had just completed my first visit to the Central African Republic. And I went, we were together there and with the Secretary General. And indeed, the Secretary General met with some victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. Just to recall my role, the idea is that I'm a global advocate for victims, and I try to entrench a rights-based approach to prevention and response to sexual exploitation and abuse by UN personnel in general. And it's very important to be aware that we're not talking about peacekeeping personnel only. We are not talking about uniformed personnel only. We're talking about across the spectrum: peacekeeping, humanitarian development, uniformed and civilian personnel. I'm supported by 4 field victims' rights advocates who work in the countries from which we've received the highest number of allegations: Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and South Sudan. And you've got in the report, quite a big part of it reflects the work that they're doing on the ground, and their work has been quite effective. And I speak with them once a month, and this morning I did indeed speak with the 4 on the latest work that they've been doing. We've done a lot, but we have so much to do, and the needs are really, really great. One cannot, and when you think about issues such as this virus, I immediately think about the people that I've seen and met in the field who have been in situations of being victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. So this is always something that I reflect on. The Secretary General's 2017 strategy really reshifted our focus with regard to how we implemented the zero tolerance approach. It refocused our attention on victims. It made us remember that, in fact, people are affected. Previously, the emphasis had really been on conduct and discipline of personnel and on the reputation of our complex family of organisations. These, I don't underrate, enormously critical issues, but I think we need to appreciate what these wrongs do to victims and their communities, what these wrongs do to the very purpose of the United Nations work, because these wrongs do indeed fracture trust. And when I look at them, I think the exploitation, not underrating abuse is appalling, but the exploitation really fractures trust in communities. We should also understand, I believe, that unless we focus on victims, we're going to have a lot of trouble preventing sexual exploitation and abuse, and certainly a lot of trouble responding appropriately. People often ask me what it means to put victims at the centre of our work. Primarily, it means that we have to encourage people to report allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse, investigate these in a victim-centred way with compassion, taking account of the fact that victims are not homogeneous, that there will be children, people with disabilities. And then we must do what we can to hold victims accountable. Through the means the UN has at its disposal, which of course are administrative and disciplinary, and by working with member states, justice and possible redress, because that's where you get the legal redress and where you may find that, where one hopes we find more and more, real accountability. And we're doing that. We also have to appreciate our special responsibility to support victims receive practical assistance, whether that's medical care, legal representation, skills training or other help, so that they can rebuild their lives and go beyond any stigma that they may experience from being victims of United Nations personnel, which may be a different stigmatization than being victims of others. And we have a big responsibility, and this is an area which is a huge emphasis of mine, to help the children born of sexual exploitation and abuse who are generally abandoned by their fathers. Now, I meet with victims whenever I travel to where the UN works, and of course now I won't be travelling to wherever the UN works for a little while. And our field victims' rights advocates maintain a continual one-on-one relationship with those victims that they know about. And they make sure that they receive the assistance and services they need. One important thing is to be aware is it's a not one-size-fits-all situation. Every victim has a different need, and that is what those people do on the ground. There are only 4, and I really, really, really push that there are more appointed so they can do that everywhere. We have a big footprint, and that there are people with those sorts of functions where we have a smaller footprint. An important part of what we do is help victims get information that they need to keep abreast of investigations into their allegations and any follow-up processes within the UN and elsewhere, and in particular with regard to claims they're making regarding paternity and child support. And certainly when I speak to victims, this is one of their biggest grievances. Okay, I've reported, or a report's been made, an investigation has taken place, either first by the UN with if there is a member state, if it's a troop, if a uniformed personnel by their countries who investigate these things, but they don't hear much any further. Paternity claims, let me go back to those, they're complex. They often involve several jurisdictions, require us to work with member states. So we're working on ways to get for the women to gain access to the legal support they need to pursue those claims. And you'll see in our report that we refer to the twinning that we're doing with pro bono lawyers in countries of jurisdiction and country where the event happened, and also with national human rights institutions. Just to finish, when I speak to these victims, and I always say I'm a lawyer and law is always uppermost in my mind, but what they're very, very interested in is immediate, medium-term support, and in particular to see a way that they can reinsert themselves within their communities. When I went to Haiti several years ago, I met with a group of women, quite a large group of women and their children, who the children were from the MINUSTA days. And what they spoke to me about predominantly was their children. Those children couldn't go to school on a regular basis because they couldn't afford the fees, they couldn't afford the lunches that children would take to school, and they couldn't afford the uniforms. After I met them, and this is sort of sticking things together with sticky tape to a certain extent, I worked with our with fellow UN organisations in Haiti, and we put together a project which is still ongoing, which is described in the report, which allows for the provision of school fees and ancillary issues for those children, and has expanded to ensure that those women have had some support to get to build livelihoods. And indeed, several of them, they're very enterprising, have started their own small businesses as a result of the work that we have done. This is important not only for themselves, but also because it's a protective shield. It creates a community awareness and also and doesn't allow for or limits the level of re-victimisation of the women who've already been subject to sexual exploitation and abuse, but also spreads further, as I've seen in our work in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we have quite a few projects which address livelihood support for women and men who have been subject to sexual exploitation and abuse. And we have seen that they've done very well with mushroom farming, selling their products, basket weaving, and so on and so forth. So this is an area that we need to expand. There's so much to do, however. There have been some positive outcomes, but there's a lot more work to do. I'm happy to take questions, but just be aware, my area is on the victims. That's my focus. Clearly, I am interested in accountability, but this is the real area. Thank you.
Edie.
Thank you very much, Ms. Connors. On behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association, welcome. Thank you for doing this, and welcome back. My name is Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. I did have two questions on the report. One of them that I think surprised me was that in terms of the investigations completed since 2010, only 42% of allegations were substantiated, while 58% were unsubstantiated. What's the reason that the majority of claims were not substantiated? And secondly, the majority of allegations in 2019, 70% related to MINUSCA, which is Central African Republic, which was 41, and MONUSCO in the Congo, which is 15. Why, after all these years of work in both countries, are these figures still the highest? And in terms of paternity, how many or what percentage of paternity claims have actually been able to identify the fathers? And when you were talking about the four countries, the four missions that where you have victims, advocates, I believe you said Central African Republic, Congo, and South Sudan. What was the fourth?
Haiti.
Was it
Haiti.
Haiti? Okay.
Okay, so I can have a bash at some of these. We've got Haiti as the fourth. With regard to the paternity claims, they're very difficult because the issue is that you have to get the man, in general terms, to provide some form of his DNA, for example, and that is usually something that is done by consent. What we do know of, certainly in Haiti, we're looking at 27 women, 28 actually, a few more have come in, and this will be relevant to the next question, the second question you asked me. What we need to do is support those women pursue those paternity claims, because unless you solve the paternity claim, you've got no way forward with regard to child support. Though we have various cases wherein the parties do agree, and that's sealed in a courtroom. But but I can't give you percentages in terms of how many, but I do know we have we do have 27 women with unresolved paternity claims, which means they haven't moved forward to have the claim resolved, relating to about 33 children in Haiti alone. What I want to do this year, God willing, is to get the numbers from across the UN system, see where we are and what we need to do. And what we have been doing is engaging these pro bono lawyers who have brought cases in the countries where the men are found. But there are these good cases where the parties do agree. But then there are other complications, such as how you get the money to a remote country, which again we have to solve. So it's all one by one by one. With regard to the numbers, what do they say? Lies, lies, and damn statistics. Numbers can hide a lot of things. Some of those reports are from years gone by. And indeed, this case I spoke of with regard to Haiti was a case that is about 10 years old. So people will come in at a later time, but they're recorded in terms of the year that the report covers. So it's the reporting year. So that's one element. We have been pretty aggressive with regard to outreach also, because if we don't outreach, people don't come forward and report. So one of the reasons may well be, of course, that there are more people who are prepared to come forward because of the outreach which has been done, because the Secretary-General takes a new approach with looking at the victim. And in those countries, of course, both of them have field VRAs. So they're out there in the community telling them about what their role is, and that could explain it. So I can't explain, but certainly they could be older cases as well as the cases for the reporting year, the outreach, and then the fact that we have field victims' rights advocates in those countries. I can't give you a clear answer as to why the cases are unsubstantiated, but there could be many reasons. Perhaps the victim decides she doesn't want to proceed further. She is, of course, the witness in the case. Perhaps there's there's an issue with regard to the evidentiary requirements. I can find out. My Office of Internal Oversight Services Investigations part will be able to explain it in greater detail. But I myself, I'm not an investigator, so I don't. What I do get involved in is working to ensure that the investigations proceed in a way, and sometimes I can ensure, sometimes I can't, proceed in a way which will be victim-centred. So will, in fact, be done in a place where a victim may feel more comfortable, and in another place will allow the victim's rights advocate, for example, to accompany that victim so that victim feels secure and so on. So,
Yep, go ahead.
Hi, Matthias Ask from TV2 Norway. I was wondering, have you seen any change in the past 2 years and a half since the Me Too movement, whether it's member states taking the issue of sexual exploitation and abuse more seriously or victims being more willing to come forward?
Just bear in mind that sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment are different. I don't think I've seen anything that could be referred to Me Too, because we're dealing with people who I'm sure are unfamiliar with Me Too. So the sort of person who who is in a situation of vulnerability, which allows them to be victimized, to be exploited, and so on, is not, I believe, the sort of person who's pursuing a Me Too whatever. I think much has happened because of the turning things around with sexual exploitation and abuse to think of the victim first. Well, they don't all think of the victim first, but when I'm around, they'll say that. But just that you have processes, that you have these advocates, that we have the broader system has prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse coordinators, all of this, and the system-wide nature. I mean, there's still a way to go, but we're working together across the system, and we're also working with those outside the system. So I think that's more to do with why there has been some improvement rather than a Me Too thing. I think with states, I mean, it's such a big issue for a state. I mean, in general terms, the head of state is, if you're talking about troops, the head of state is the head of the army, no? In most countries. So these are the things that do affect their consideration. And this work, the issue with the voluntary compact, of course, the circle of leadership that the Secretary General has also put together to get leaders to stand with him.
Yes, Carla.
Thank you. Carla Stay, Global Research. Very often, vulnerable victims of abuse will be threatened with retaliation if they come forth. How do you break through that kind of fear, which continues the control of the victim? And it can, the retaliation can be overt, it can be covert, it can be by the perpetrator or by his friends. And how do you deal with that?
I think very often there are many, many reasons why we have retaliation and also inducements. So perpetrators are in a position where they're providing for the victim, perhaps, for the victim's family, and there will be greater inducements and they may therefore withdraw. We're seeking to work out ways to provide protection for them. This is an area which is a big gap. I've just looked at 13 countries where we have a big UN footprint, different UN footprint, and the reporting in some is nil, and we know that the cases exist because of the nature of the power relationship between our personnel and the people on the ground. And this is something, I don't know how we do it, but this is something that is very much on our minds. The member state, of course, has the primary responsibility with regard to protecting its citizens and those in its borders. But of course, often we have weak situations, and we do seek as much as we can. But there's a way to go. But we're fully aware of these problems. And with regard to reporting and so on, we've established community-based mechanisms. Some of them are strong, some less so. So there is a less overt method of reporting. So those are the sorts of things that come into play. Of course, in an accountability process, the victim will be the witness. So that is where things become very difficult. So these projects that provide for livelihood support and allow people to gain their own, sort of self-reliance do have a protective capacity. And we have those projects together with other people. We're not saying, okay, this is a project for victims of sexual exploitation and abuse only. So there's a capacity to move out of it.
Jane, thank you very much for coming on this busy day.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks.